Good morning. I'm Judith Patten, Project Director of All Energy and Dcarbonise, and also co-creator of All Energy, the show that has grown in stature and size to become the UK's largest renewable and low-carbon energy exhibition and conference. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to our opening plenary session, Path to Net Zero. Traditionally, on opening morning, I stand behind the lectern to do the housekeeping bits and pieces, give stats on the show that's just opening up. It's very strange to be here at my desk, only able to see 3 of my fellow speakers, but I'm not panicking about the absence of the 4th. That's all under control. I'd like to start with a poll to give me an idea about all of you filling our virtual conference hall. Enough of you have actually registered for this session to fill SEC's Lomond Auditorium, not once, not twice, but 3 times over. Can I have the first poll, please? Now, I hope that you're all pressing away like mad. And I hope that somebody will tell me when I can get on with the next one and when I can move on to say some more gushing words. I think you've probably had long enough to do that poll. So, round about this time, 20 years ago, I and my fellow creator, David Stott, were starting to make plans for the very first All Energy that would be held in Aberdeen in February 2001, making the 2020 show the 20th show in the series. Birthday cake should have been rushed out round about now. Dcarbonise, held alongside and concentrating on low carbon heat, energy efficiency and the built environment, and low carbon transport, is just 2 years old this year. There were 2 things I wasn't prepared for in 2001: deep snow and the amazing buzz and excitement within our small event. 350 people came, 250 as conference delegates, and 100 more to visit our tiny exhibition with just 50 exhibiting companies. That buzz, that excitement was something you almost wanted to bottle and keep taking a sniff of. It caused me to fall hook, line and sinker for the amazing people I met there and have done ever since. The show grew and grew and was acquired in 2011 by Reed Exhibitions, meaning more talented people to work with and the ability to develop the show. 2015 saw a move to Glasgow, and 2019 the addition of Dcarbonise. And now, in the new normal, thanks to COVID-19, we're discovering the power of the virtual world. Staggeringly, over 3,600 people have registered for our inaugural quartet of webinars. By 9 o'clock this morning, 1,535 of you for this session. Some, I'm sure, are going to watch it on demand rather than sitting in our virtual conference hall. This afternoon, we have our first offshore wind session. Tomorrow morning, it's the turn of heat, sponsored by the Scottish Government. And tomorrow afternoon, hydrogen, all topics I know we will return to later in the webinar series. We'll be holding a mini festival of them each month. Can I thank all of our speakers in this series and our chairs, Matt Smith, Keith McLean and Nigel Holmes. Unlike our normal opening plenary session, which I crammed so full we don't have any time for questions, we do have time at the end of this session. So just use the facility marked on your screen to type them in. And if it's for a particular speaker, do add his or her name, please. We'd like your feedback on the webinar too, and your ideas for future ones. And should you be a keen blogger, we welcome blogs. So just let us know that you're ready, willing, and able. Before I introduce the first of our speakers, there's another poll. So could you put that up, please? And start answering, folk. This is looking obviously at climate change and post-COVID activity and whether we will actually revert to get industry back on its feet to fossil fuels, or whether, thanks to breathing in ever cleaner air, I'm on the flight path into Heathrow, and I can assure you it is glorious to have so few planes, and the air is certainly sweeter smelling, and the birds are gloriously vocal. So again, can we see the poll results as soon as possible, please? In the meantime, I can tell you that 56% of you have been to an all energy and 43% haven't. So we look forward to keeping in touch with you and telling you more about the show. Right, now, next, could we have the results of that poll as soon as possible, please? So if I'm understanding those right, we have, this is interesting. We have 46% of people believe that fossil fuels will come rushing back, and 53% believe that we will fight to keep our cleaner air and get closer to net zero. Now it's time to introduce our virtual speaker, Chris Stark. Chris is busy doing something else this morning, but very kindly recorded what he wanted to say. And I know that it will really hit the spot. So sadly, no questions for him. I'm sure that you don't really need me to tell you very much about Chris. He's the Chief Executive of the UK Committee on Climate Change. And that, of course, is the public body tasked by the Climate Change Act to be the independent authority on tackling climate change. He leads a team of analysts and specialists offering expert insight into the challenges of reducing UK emissions and adapting to the changing climate. He led the CC's work in 2019 to recommend a new net zero target for the UK, now, of course, brought into law. He speaks regularly on the transition to a zero carbon economy and the need to confront climate change with urgency. He's a raft of experience in government. He designed economic policy in Whitehall, including HM Treasury and the former Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. He was previously, and this is where All Energy and he first got together, Director of Energy and Climate Change in the Scottish Government, leading the development of Scottish energy and climate strategies. His passion for his subject shines through everything he does. Like another of our speakers sitting behind our virtual presenters table, he's an expert lead for Climate Assembly UK. Without any more ado, I'd like to introduce Chris Stark.
Hi everyone, and thanks for letting me join you this morning at the virtual conference. And in these very odd times, thanks very much for letting me record this message to you. I'm afraid I can't join you live. And what a difference a year makes. It was just a year ago that I stood on the platform at the All Energy Conference, just a few days after we'd published our advice to government on net zero. And in that advice, we spelled out the need to set a new goal for cutting emissions to net zero in the UK. And we also set out the steps necessary to get there. And this had been the year when we were going to see momentum, I hope, towards the actions that would deliver that goal overall. This was a very big year, culminating, of course, in the plan to have the next big climate summit in Glasgow, the COP26. And I'm sitting here in Glasgow recording this message to you today, and of course everything has changed. It is now all about COVID and what lies ahead. So what I'd like to try and do today is to talk about net zero, but also to talk about achieving net zero in the midst of the coronavirus and the steps that will follow. And try and give some sense of why I think that is still the right target and how we can make sure that the steps that lie ahead get us on track. So let's start, and I think it's useful to divide up the future into the short, the medium and the long term, and I'll do that if I can in reverse order and start with the long term. And the irony is that despite the enormous changes that we've seen in economic activity and with greenhouse gas emissions with it in the recent weeks, the long term hasn't changed at all. So when it comes to the climate, we face the same problems that we did just a few weeks ago. It is true that emissions have dropped like a stone in recent weeks, and it is true that this year we will probably see the biggest ever fall in greenhouse gas emissions globally. But the climate hasn't really blinked, so we are still adding carbon dioxide to our atmosphere. We are still going to need to tackle that. At present levels, we are probably at a level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere we haven't had for 2 or 3 million years. And 2 or 3 million years ago, we had seas that were 20 meters higher than they are now. So we still need to act on that. And the scientific goal is still to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. That's the point at which we will stop warming the planet globally. And therefore, we still have this enduring mission here in the UK to cut emissions in every sector to the point where we can get to net zero by 2050 at the latest. That means zero carbon transport, that means zero carbon energy provision. That means changing the way we use land and agriculture on that land, and changes in the way that we have industry take place in the UK so we can cut emissions there, and changes in the home so that we have a more energy efficient way of living in our homes and a lower carbon way of heating them. Those issues remain. They haven't really changed, but of course COVID and the post-coronavirus economy changes utterly the context for how we will get there. So we need to think about what will happen in the short and the medium term, and I think this is probably where the most interesting questions lie. So in the medium term, and by that I mean over the next 10 or 15 years, there are still lots and lots of questions about what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen with the oil price. We don't know what's going to happen with how behaviours might change after this lockdown. Might we move more easily to remote working and travelling less? Might we have to do that? Might we see bigger changes in industry and the composition of the economy happening more quickly perhaps than we thought? And some other slightly more sobering things. Might there be less capital available for investment? And can we focus what capital there is available on the right things so that we cut emissions overall? Overall, these are big questions for the medium term that this year the Committee on Climate Change are going to try and throw some light on. But as we speak today, it's still not clear exactly where we sit with all of that. It's really in the short term that for me the most interesting questions and priorities are now becoming clear. And you may know that we wrote recently to the Prime Minister and to the First Ministers of all of the UK nations to give our advice on how to shape up the steps necessary in the short term to get us on track for net zero, but also to recover the economy and to make sure that the economy is more resilient to the effects of climate change in the future. So I want to run through some of that with you in the second half of this talk to you this morning. So firstly, on investment, our clear message to the government is let's drive the economic recovery, let's drive the need for new jobs and the creation of those jobs by making climate investments. That means investments in those things that reduce emissions, also investments in those things that will help us manage climate change itself. We know the things that we need to invest in to cut our emissions. We set all of that out last year and the government were listening, and there was a real momentum towards building a plan to meet the net zero goal. So let's use that as a way to get prepared and to respond to the recession that we're in at the moment. That means investing in things like energy efficient homes, investing in electric vehicle charging, investing in renewable energy. These investments are sensible, they'll create new jobs, they're spread right across the UK and they have multiple benefits. So with those investments come better air quality, even improvements in health. So it makes a great deal of sense for the government to bring forward those investments as quickly as they can. Secondly, positive behaviours coming out of this. Let's try and encourage those positive changes in the way that we live our life, some of which we've had a glimpse of during the lockdown, as a means to cut emissions, but also as a means to get the economy going. The lockdown and the measures necessary for the lockdown are not a prescription in any way for tackling climate change, but they have given us a glimpse of what it would be like in a world where we were not burning fossil fuels, particularly in our cities. We've all experienced cleaner air, those of you who've had the experience in cities. We've come to value our green spaces more and more. So some of the things we've experienced, we might wish to encourage more as social distancing becomes a memory. That means remote working potentially becoming less of a scary thing for us and reducing our business travel needs. We've even done things like remote medical consultations and moved so swiftly to that being the norm as well. These steps, if we stick with some of them, can help us tackle climate change and make lives better. So let's think again about investment plans, particularly for things like roads. Imagine if we spent a little less on roads and road transport and a little bit more on cycle provision and broadband provision coming out of this. That would seem a really good, sensible step to make in the midst of this crisis. Thirdly, let's avoid locking in the use of greenhouse gases, so ensuring that the recovery doesn't lock in our use of fossil fuels and instead locks in those cleaner alternatives overall. The government has done remarkable things in the middle of this crisis to protect jobs and industries. They may need to do remarkable things as we come out of it too. So let's learn the lessons of previous recessions. Let's not lock in our use of fossil fuels by making those fuels cheaper, for example, or by investing in high carbon industries. Let's flip it round and invest in low emissions. Let's invest in renewable energy. Let's invest in more energy efficient homes. Let's talk more about electric vehicles and how we can hasten that transition too. And if the time comes for bailouts, then the governments can consider what strings it might attach to improve over time industrial decarbonisation too for those industries it supports. This can be a really important and useful moment for us to reset the path of emissions towards a lower carbon future. Fourthly, and related to that, are tax changes and getting the tax policies right as we come out of this, so we create the right incentives for decarbonisation whilst getting the economy ticking as well. We already knew that tax changes were on the cards. We need to think more of how we can change that tax framework that we have in the UK to tax high carbon and encourage low carbon. And it can be a really good moment to sort out the public finances as we think about the need to do that and think about taxing carbon more, particularly when at the moment fossil fuel prices are rock bottom, so the consumer needn't notice. That can be a hugely important step in again, addressing the profile and trajectory of emissions in the UK in the future. And lastly, the issue of fairness. Let's make sure the recovery is fair. We already knew that the steps towards net zero we're going to bring into the frame the question of how we manage fairness across the economy, protecting those consumers who can least afford new costs and protecting industries so they are still competitive in the future. That's even more of a challenge now as we come out of coronavirus, which has really exposed and exacerbated some of the existing inequalities we have in the UK. And it will have, sadly, a potentially big regional impact for some industries across the UK. Let's spread the load so the costs are spread fairly, and also the benefits, they need to be spread fairly too. And this is a moment to think carefully about unfreezing policies and making sure that we freeze them in the right way to get on track for net zero in a fair way. Jumping out from that, there are some really clear priorities that we need to focus on as we think about the post-coronavirus economy. Firstly, reskilling, retraining programs and research itself. Let's train the designers, the builders and the installers that we'll need for a low carbon future. And especially for things like low carbon heating, where we know we haven't got the installer base yet to get on track for the things that need to be done. Secondly, related to that is the big question of housing retrofits and making our new homes fit for the future. Making our homes more energy efficient is such a sensible priority coming out of this. It's a regionally spread question. We can get teams of people working on that now, and we'll see the benefits in the future. Street by street across the UK, this is a sensible step to make. We know the things that need to be done to improve energy retrofits for existing homes and to build new homes to the right standard. Thirdly is about tree planting, restoring peatlands, restoring our natural environment, and also reversing the decline that we've seen recently in our green spaces in towns and cities. We know we need more trees as a store of carbon. That's a good place to start for new opportunities and new employment chances in the future. We need more green space. We will need more peatland to be restored. Let's use that as a basis for new employment coming out of this. Fourthly, strengthening our energy networks, something so important for all energy, of course. We know we have a load of investment to do in our energy networks to grow and strengthen, especially the electricity network for the new demands we'll have in a net zero future. This is a good moment to think about that. So let's plan now to build the right networks, not just electricity networks, also heat networks, so that we're ready in the future and we can say that we use this time wisely. And lastly, an obvious thing to say, but let's make it easy as we come out of this for people to walk and cycle and to work remotely. And that means investing now in things like broadband infrastructure and investing now in using our roads differently so that we don't, in a world of social distancing coming out of this, drive people towards car use and congestion. There is a moment for that to happen, and remarkably, some of the messages we've seen from the government over the last few weeks show us that that's the way they're thinking too. So this is a really, big moment that we wouldn't have had even just a few months ago to try and change the patterns of transport use in this country and get them on track for net zero as well. And my last message to you is that we still have the COP in Glasgow to look forward to. That will now happen next year. And in next year, the UK will have the presidency of the G7 summit. And that means that I think the focus we've put on climate change domestically will have resonance internationally too. So if we want to be a strong president of the G7 and of the COP next year, and such an important moment, of course, for the UK to show that international collaboration is still on the cards and can still happen after coronavirus, then I think we need to connect that with the domestic ambition on climate change. That means cutting emissions here in the UK as a means to be more effective in the presidency of these global summits next year. So everything over the course of this year and into next year is still focused on net zero, but now needs to be focused on recovering well from COVID in a pro-climate way. And if we do that, hopefully this time next year, I'll be able to speak to you directly this time and talk about how we use this time wisely to get ourselves back on track for net zero in the UK, and what a positive message that would be overall. Thanks very much.
Well, I spoke about Chris treating everything with passion. We certainly had it there, and some really riveting facts. Can I ask my three panelists, just for a very quick takeaway from that, what gives you great hope? Becky?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what I take from Chris's talk is that if this were possible, the stakes are even higher than they were last year. The opportunities in terms of COVID recovery and aligning that with climate change are huge. But as your poll showed, there's no guarantee that we're going to get this right. And so I do feel that pressure, to be honest.
Karen?
I think that the crucial, I was very pleased to hear Chris talking about fairness, and that not just in a caring sense. If things are not fair, we've seen by electoral events how people can turn against policy areas. And I think one thing that we have seen that's really been brought to the fore is that the COVID shutdown, the lockdown, has really brought out some of the inequities in society, because the people who are suffering most are those people who are least able to pay, who we should be concerned about with net zero.
Yes, when he said that bit, I thought particularly of you and the just transition. Keith?
Yeah, look, thanks, Judith. I think a lot of good stuff from Chris as always, and I think maybe one of the other critical things there was about as we come out of this lockdown, people have to do weird and wonderful and strange things and work differently, but it's about making sure we don't lock in some bad behaviours, and particularly if you think about short term, there are some messages that are going to go out about not using public transport, and what we need to do though is to make sure that doesn't encourage a massive shift back to fossil fuels and use of petrol and diesel. So just making sure we build in the right behaviours from day one and don't lock in bad behaviours. And I think that's a really, really important thing for us to look at.
Yeah, plenty of food for thought. And now, sir, it is your turn to go to the lectern, please. Now, Keith is Chief Executive of ScottishPower. One hell of a job, and interesting and challenging times, I know, for you at the moment. He's also a very great friend to All Energy and a superb supporter of women in all parts of their careers, and the father of daughters, two of whom, I might say, are doing their bit medically as students, but volunteering on the COVID front. Wow, what a family. Keith, can I ask you to give your path to net zero, please?
Look, yeah, thanks, Judith, and thanks for your kind words in the introduction. And it's great to see you. It's brilliant that we've got this up and running in one way, shape, or form. It's a bit different and a bit strange, but I miss you coming and giving me a huge big hug. But we'll sort that out hopefully in the not too distant future, Judith.
Not as much as I miss giving it to you, I might say. Now I'll take a vow of silence.
No, okay. So look, thank you, and look, thanks to all the people who are dialing in and watching this and listening to this either live or recorded. A lot of good stuff there from Chris, and I'll try and pick up on some of that and some of the words I talked through. I think, as a kind of quick reflection on what's happened since we were all together in Glasgow about 12 months ago, and a huge amount has obviously changed. We're in the middle of a crisis and changed everybody's life that none of us could have predicted, I don't think, and I don't think any of us have ever lived through anything quite like this before. But in all of that, we shouldn't also forget just how far the debate had moved in and around climate change and net zero since last year. And really, I think the conference and the timing of the conference last year was really just a great push and a great momentum and what went on after that. At that conference, we'd announced a partnership that we'd struck with the government and with Glasgow City Council about making Glasgow the first net zero city in the UK. We then, quite soon after the conference, saw that the UK government put into legislation the 2050 target, the Scottish government the 2045 target. We then saw a whole host of towns and cities across the UK coming forward with their own targets and their own dates and plans for getting to net zero. So a colossal shift and a colossal change. And it's, I think, really important now about how do we keep that momentum and keep that push going and use that to help us get out of the crisis as well. Lots of change and ideas around what we do with people's homes, with travel, with zero carbon communities. So I think we're in a really good, positive place. I think we also saw a massive change and have seen that change in terms of political debate with a groundswell of public opinion, but now also political opinion about how do we focus on the environment, how do we decarbonise the economy going forward. And then I suppose, if you like, to cap it all, the COP26 coming to Glasgow. And again, although that's been delayed, I still think that gives us a fantastic target and a fantastic boost. And we need to think about that and how we use that to keep pushing the debate forward in the UK. The Committee on Climate Change, I think the stuff they've been putting out and the stuff that Chris and the team set out last week about the challenges, but about the opportunity and about how we can use where we are now as an opportunity to make changes faster and push things through and really, really support the economic recovery we're going to need in the UK by pushing the green recovery and make that front and centre of the entire economic growth and recovery for the whole country. And I think that can put us on a fantastic momentum towards net zero and make the whole momentum unstoppable. And that's what we need to do, what we need to focus on. Just a couple of words briefly about where are we in the current crisis. I think the energy sector has responded incredibly well to what's going on right now. There are obviously a huge focus on the fantastic work that's being done by NHS staff, by care workers, people on the front line, and quite rightly, that's getting huge attention, as it should do. But I think as businesses and in the energy sector, I think the work that's gone on in the background has been brilliant in terms of the maintenance and the reinforcements of the system, making sure energy is continuing to flow, not just everyone's homes and houses, but to those critical services as well. And at the same time, still seeing investment come through and work going on in terms of the future development, either through planning or through construction of both onshore and offshore projects, to make sure we keep the momentum going of getting towards net zero. And then at a customer end, a huge amount of work going on as well to make sure that people stay connected to the system. And that's taking precedence. So a lot of work around how we protect vulnerable customers, a lot of work about getting preloaded prepayment cards out to people so nobody's self-disconnecting from the system. And I think it's been a great amount of work by us as a company, but right across the industry, of making sure people understand we're here to look after them, we're here to protect them, we're here to help them. And again, I think that will end up being incredibly helpful to us as we come out of this crisis, about getting people bought into how they can work with energy companies and other companies in terms of how it helps them get to net zero. In terms of investment and the commitment to investment, we are more committed now than ever about future investment in the UK. We're still planning absolutely to deliver the £1.5 billion of investment this year, down through our network, down through our onshore projects, our offshore projects, into the future infrastructure of the country. Absolutely committed to doing it. We've started work on the battery project at Whiteley. 2 weeks ago, we finished and put in the last of the 102 turbines at East Anglia offshore wind farm, and we're running through the commissioning programme now. Today, we've just announced a deal to acquire some other sites and create 165 megawatts of new onshore projects in Scotland, and that'll deliver green power to another 100,000 homes. So there's still loads and loads of stuff going on in the background. People might not be hearing as much about it right now, but we as a company, the industry, still pushing hard towards all the stuff we need to do for net zero. And it has a great impact on UK, on the recovery, on helping to create jobs, helping to create investment down through the supply chain. So 70% of all of the money we've spent so far this year has gone into UK businesses. And again, it shows you the benefit we can bring through this transition and through the push to net zero. In terms of the whole future agenda, shaping the green economy, and we've heard quite a lot of your politicians, commentators talking about how do we make sure that as we come out of the recovery, it's led by the green economy and it's led by green investment. And I think it is incredibly important. And again, I think we're in a really good place to grab that opportunity. If you look at the most mature renewables technologies, onshore and offshore wind, they're the cheapest form of investment in new generation. There are a huge number of projects coming through the pipeline and coming through the system. And I think there's a real case to push for, and a real opportunity to push for accelerating that investment, delivering more projects and bringing more projects forward. I think that will really help the push to 2050. But importantly, these are infrastructure projects, and history shows you time and time and time again, when you want to get out of an economic recession, when you want to generate economic recovery, infrastructure is so important. Infrastructure projects create huge value down through supply chains. They create huge value right across the economy. You're investing in infrastructure for 40 or 50 years for the future of the country. And what's brilliant about our sector is not only is it infrastructure, but it's green. And it helps that 2050 march. And I think a big focus on that is really important. We're hearing that and seeing that right across the world. I think there's a real acceptance across the world about using this to drive forward that economy. Stuff like the new EU Green Deal, that'll help push that conversation forward as well. So I think as businesses, regulators, stakeholders, legislators, we just now need to make sure we've got the confidence to drive forward and the confidence to build on it. The opportunities are there for us to go after. I think there's great opportunity for faster progress on onshore and offshore. I think more ambition around innovation, and let's see more stuff come through on battery storage, on our network resilience. I think more investment into that network in terms of reshaping it and changing it, making it more flexible, making it more proactive, incredibly important. That then also helps for the whole conversation and push for heat and for transport. and we've still got colossal opportunities to go after. All of that investment and that big push to switch away from petrol and diesel and get people in electric vehicles. And again, not only a huge boost to net zero, but a huge boost in terms of investment and a huge boost in terms of showing people how they can help contribute towards tackling climate change. So great levels of ambition, I think, for us and for the whole economy. And I think that really kind of leads me to, I suppose, conclusion in terms of where are we and what we've done. And I said at the start that obviously we're in a very strange situation. We've got a very immediate crisis, but I think it's really important that we don't look at tackling that crisis separately from the longer term issues of climate change. And we need to make sure as we tackle and come out of the current crisis, we do it in a way that also helps us tackle climate change. So I think that becomes incredibly important for the future and what we try and do in terms of the UK policy and in terms of UK investment. We as a company are absolutely committed to going down that path and going down that path very, very fast and with a huge level of ambition. We're doing it in terms of all of the investment in renewables, all of the investment in the network, green tariffs, everything we produce now 100% renewable, and we want to get all of that through to our customers and show our customers that everything they buy can be 100% renewable as well. So huge commitment for us. I think a massive opportunity for the industry, a colossal opportunity for the whole of the UK. And the great thing about all of this is I am absolutely convinced everybody wins out of this if we do it properly. Companies gain in terms of their investment and their growth. The country gains in terms of inward investment to the UK, manufacturing, jobs, opportunity, and customers gain because they not only get green energy and help tackle climate change, but we bring the cost of that energy down so they get cheaper energy as well. So huge opportunity. I'm really, really excited about it. I think it's a massive, massive win for us all if we do this properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. It was great to hear you use the word opportunity so many times. My word, let's hope that everybody watching at the moment and those that actually look at it as recorded grasp those opportunities. Now, attention turns, before I do that, can I, Keith, pass all our thanks to all of your men and women, and indeed throughout all utility companies who are ensuring that we are getting electricity, we are functioning as normal. We don't know the blood, sweat and tears that goes into it, but they're doing a tremendous job.
Thanks,
now,
Judith.
for Professor Karen Turner, what can I say about, I won't, Karen, it's okay. Karen is Director of the Centre for Energy Policy at the University of Strathclyde, and she is, it's got lots on it. Well, she's got the picture, we've got the whole kit and caboodle now, and a Just Transition Commissioner, which is a very difficult thing to say. The Scottish Just Transition Commission is an important element, I know, of her work. And she will be talking about that. And, well, off you go, Karen. I've suddenly lost the plot there for a second. It was seeing the screen that did it for me.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Judith. With huge appreciation to you and all of the All Energy team for actually bringing us together virtually this morning to explore this important topic of our path to net zero. My focus within the session is ensuring prosperity in the race to net zero and the crucial need to address the challenge of balancing how we drastically reduce our carbon emissions while ensuring a just transition. Our focus in research on this issue at the University of Strathclyde Centre for Energy Policy emerges from the fact that transitioning to net zero won't be easy, and taking the leading role in the global effort that the Scottish and UK governments have committed to, even less so. Especially now, getting on the road at a time when people, businesses and government are pressing priorities in getting social, economic and societal well-being back on track. So the need is more urgent than ever to recognise and consider what we need to do in transitioning to the net zero as a question of how we evolve our economy, our society and our lives. Now, the easier side of that is to identify where net economic and benefits can emerge and evolve, and if we plan and do things the right way. The more challenging side is where there might be net costs for some time and or for lasting into the foreseeable future, because that really pushes us to consider who pays, how and when. If you click onto the next slide, this is the central focus of our research at CEP, that developing narratives around which consensus can build and empower real policy action to actually doing things. I see the challenge as having two important and two crucially important and challenging dimensions. To recognise that these are challenges that can be overcome, but to do that we've got to acknowledge first that there are real issues around the economic and societal challenge of transitioning to net zero and the politics thereof. Second, we need to reset and ask the right questions, including developing understanding of the potential economic, social, societal consequences of different actions and how these consequences could be affected to actually unlock solutions. Third, we need to get people involved in the right people involved in the conversation and the research that informs that and the way forward. The second thing is to recognise that achieving a just transition that is fair to all and ideally reduces inequalities in our society is crucial if there's to be societal and therefore political buy-in for the whole net zero agenda and pathways therein. We also need to recognise that the justness of the transition, how people's lives are affected and changed, depends on us understanding and dealing with the fact that industry raising issues around the need to sustain their competitiveness and doing business in the UK is not just about serving their shareholders. It's about people's jobs and livelihoods, not just in those industries, but in the extensive network of supply chains they support now and which we want them to continue to support and increasingly rely on going forward. So if you can click on the slide, please. In short, it's all about prosperity for people, not least where we in the UK have taken a leading role in committing to and delivering net zero. How do we make this work for us? How do we maximise our flexibility and resilience and the flexibility of policy decision makers and ensure hopefully improving economic performance? How do we build commitment around what will be long-term courses of action? These questions apply to all aspects of the net zero challenge, but we've been engaged in one particular theme of research that's been funded by the Bellona Foundation and the UK CCSRC that focuses on addressing them in the context of industrial decarbonisation. Slide, please. We took a first pass at considering the carbon capture element of carbon capture and storage from a wider economic and just transition perspective. The key issue for us as social scientists is understanding the implications of actions. So for firms, doing carbon capture means the need to use more equipment or capital to produce the same outputs. This reduces their capital efficiency, which impacts the return to capital. Now that can be restored by raising prices, but doing that is problematic where firms are operating in an international marketplace where competitors are not all doing the same. It's about relative competitiveness. So far, we've focused our applied work on the Scottish chemical sectors. If firms lose competitiveness and demand and possibly ultimately relocate their production elsewhere, offshoring, the cost to Scottish and wider UK society will be the loss of high value industry and supply chain jobs. Our research has shown that the Scottish chemical sector brings a wage premium with own sector and average supply chain wage rates above the Scottish average. If there are job losses, workers may move to find work elsewhere, reducing Scotland's human capital. Generally, if the sector were to contract, there'd be a contraction in the Scottish economy, earnings and tax receipts. In the scenarios we considered, where chemicals industry prices had to rise by between 4 and 8% due to the cost of doing carbon capture, the increase could cause a lasting contraction in Scottish GDP of at least £175 million per annum, take around 40 million a year out of the Scottish budget and reduce chemical industry jobs by 10% or about 600, with a further 750 jobs at risk in the wider Scottish supply chain. So what if we pay another way? What if government invested via subsidies sufficient to avoid the competitiveness loss? Now this shouldn't be a state aid issue if the case is made effectively. The aim wouldn't be to distort markets, rather government would be acting to avoid competitiveness loss enacted to correct the market failure of climate change. The aim would be to secure industry and supply chain activities, jobs and earnings in an area of the economy which, remember, tends to be located in regions where there's a real need for levelling up, where demand and capacity are hard to replace. But someone needs to pay. We consider the impacts of the costs of the subsidy being fully socialised through income tax. Now, we often talk about socialising costs, but it's a tricky political area. So a question to the audience is, would you be happy for your taxes to be used to support industrial decarbonisation, or more generally to help shift the burden off those least able to pay? And we've put that in the poll that you'll be able to vote now or very soon. That direct question aside, we consider the implications of using income tax anyway. Any increase in income tax will cause a different kind of contraction in the economy. People have less money to spend. We found that the GDP contraction would be significantly reduced, but it would hit different parts of the economy, specifically in the activities and jobs in the sectors where households actually spend their money and the supply chains of those sectors. We found there could be greater job losses than if industry has to bear all the costs, unless, of course, chemical firms decided to fully offshore. Our simulation suggested that household spending could be, the household that could be lost ultimately supports around 2,500 jobs in Scotland, albeit in less well-paid sectors, so that on the one hand, the earnings and future tax implications, tax income implications would be less severe than a contraction in the chemical sector, but the just transition requires that we protect the lower paid too. So what's the solution? Could other elements of our net zero portfolio boost household incomes and spending power, such as ones that reduce the cost of heating our homes and delivering our transport needs? Indeed, other net zero actions generate enough public revenues to remove the need to actually increase taxation to pay for this costly element of industrial decarbonisation, a need that would hopefully decline as other nations and competitors in the international marketplace follow in taking this type of costly action. These are the type of issues that we investigate and discuss in our research. Net zero is an economic system and societal challenge as much, if not more, than an energy system and a technology one. Or at least we need to join up our thinking, discussions and research on all of these elements. So on to the final slide. At CEP, we've been working on principles for an effective and feasible societal transition to net zero, not limited to industrial decarbonisation. And we've identified what we've labelled as our 5 birthday messages, because CEP is 5 years old this month. The first one is understanding who really pays, how and when, and what gains can be used to balance this is absolutely fundamental. Second, we need to find pathways that allow us to sustain and grow our prosperity in an equitable way. Third, finding options and pathways that can deliver near-term economic returns is crucial, especially but not exclusively in a post-coronavirus pandemic economic environment. Fourth, offshoring is not the answer if it only shifts emissions, jobs and GDP overseas. And finally, to reiterate, net zero is a societal and a public policy challenge more than it's an energy policy or a technological one. So we need urgently to reconsider how we go about the net zero conversation and the research that informs this. So I think I'm going to close there, but just to see if we've got our poll results. So would we support our income taxes being used to protect manufacturing and energy industry jobs? Well, 65% of you said yes to that. 28% said maybe, and 7% said no. And then when we asked, would you be willing to pay more so that lower income households could be protected? 64% of you said yes, but 26% of you only said maybe, and 11% said no. So we can see even within this informed energy policy community, it's not absolutely clear that while we talk about government should pay and the taxpayer should pay, that we're even all behind that. So the challenge is open to us. And we hope, thank you very much for the time, and please do get in touch with us and learn about what we're doing at CEP. Back to you, Judith.
Thank you, Karen. Can I just ask a very quick question before we go on to Becky? You did touch on the near time then. How important do you think that the learnings from your work are as far as the short term is concerned? I think of you as a sort of long-term organisation rather than the week after next or the month after next. Obviously, I'm thinking post-COVID.
Yeah, and I think this is really important because we've heard a lot of discussion almost as if there might be an either or. Do we go green or do we not? And I think the challenge here is, we need to be very aware that people's priorities are going to be in restoring income and jobs and things like that. And I think it's up to us, the people who are looking to move towards net zero, to show that net zero actions can contribute to that and be important. So it's not an either or. We find a place for net zero within the stimulus package. And there are real opportunities, things that will deliver and put money in people's pockets in the near term, things that I think crucially we want to do the stimulus so that we can easily move back onto the net zero path going forward. But I'd reiterate back to this point, when we think about fairness and who pays, this isn't just a question about people who want to be fair. If we don't do it in a fair way, it won't be acceptable. And we've seen in very recent past how electoral events can really disrupt policy. We do need to get societal buy-in for what we're doing here. It can't be imposed.
Thank you. Now, to our final speaker, who we've not had the pleasure of having at All Energy, so I can't say a great friend to All Energy, but I sincerely hope that you'll be joining us at a live show. Rebecca Willis is Professor in Practice at Lancaster Environment Centre, expert lead, like Chris Stark, for Climate Assembly UK, the National Citizens' Assembly on Climate Change. She seems to me to be green through and through. I'd love to know what really got her going on this tack early on in life. In 2009, she founded Green Alliance's Climate Leadership Programme, which is an initiative to support members of the UK Parliament, and she still supports Green Alliance's work in this area. She was a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UKRI Energy Programme, council member of the Natural Environment Research Council, vice chair of UK Sustainable Development Commission, and director of Green Alliance. And she was recently at the Youth Climate Change Summit. So hopefully you're going to tell us a bit about that, Becky. And last but not least, she has a new book out called Too Hot to Handle, The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change. And now we have a brief commercial break. That's available from Bristol University Press at discounted price. And there's extra discount available if you sign up for their mailing list first. Sadly, I didn't know that when I ordered my copy, and I'm waiting patiently for it to arrive. We don't have to wait any longer. Becky, over to you.
Thank you, Judith, and thanks for that little advert. It means I don't have to grubby myself by doing that myself. I'm joining you from the Lake District where I live, practically in Scotland, and I should warn you that I've got a retired sheepdog asleep at my feet. So if you hear some gentle snoring, that'll be Danny. There's a couple of polls coming your way. You can answer those while I introduce my talk, and then it will become clear why I'm asking you these questions. So I imagine that most, if not all of you who've come along to this event this morning will be involved in some way in the path to net zero. You might work in renewables or zero carbon innovation or finance. And over the 20 years or so that I've worked in this centre, the levels of investment in zero carbon and the sheer numbers of us working on these issues has grown immensely, and that's incredible progress. And I think, though, with that comes a danger, and it's this, that lots of us spend time on thinking about the perfect path to net zero, the perfect roadmap scenario, and in short, we focus on what needs to happen, what combination of technologies and policies. And we need to do that because having the very best evidence about the innovation and those technologies that can get us to net zero is absolutely crucial. But my research takes a slightly different focus, and it echoes some of the things that Karen was talking about. I'm focused much less on what needs to happen and more on how that might happen, how it might be brought about. And that's why I've asked you these two questions. The first question was, do you think that government needs to act if we're to get to net zero? In other words, do we need changes to policy and regulation? And the results have just come in, and there's an overwhelming, it almost feels like a cheaty question to ask, because there's an overwhelming yes, 96% of you. The second question is, do you want to live in a democracy? And again, I'm not surprised, I've asked audiences this before. Again, you know, 96% of you say yes. I always want to ask the people who put their hands up or say no, why? And I think there's an interesting debate there. But basically, we're all bought into the idea of democracy. So what this illustrates for me is that the crucial question we face is how we as a democratic society move forward, how we as a democratic society get to net zero. So knowing the urgency of the science and having evidence of the solutions is necessary, but not sufficient. And we do know this, but it's really not discussed very much. And I think Karen put it really well when she said that getting to net zero is not just a technical or a scientific question, it's a deeply social and deeply political question. And most fundamentally, and you know, this echoes many centuries of political thinking, it's about a social contract between the state and its citizens. And that's what I talk about in the book. Never launch a book 2 days into lockdown, by the way. It's the very worst moment, I can tell you. But so let me take this idea of the social contract and look at both sides of it. And I'm going to do that, and then I'll suggest a way forward. So the state, we've agreed, you've all agreed with me in your poll results that we need government on side, and that means we need politicians on side. And I've spent the past few years researching how politicians think about climate change. And to summarise my findings, politicians know they need to act on climate change. They might not fully grasp the urgency, but they understand the problem, but they're nervous about leading the way. And there are two reasons why they're nervous. Firstly, because it requires a break from the status quo. And, you know, for hundreds of years, we've taken a stable climate for granted. We've taken for granted plentiful energy and fossil fuels. And we've lived with these assumptions for so long that to question them is very difficult. It's culturally difficult. And MPs who speak out tell me that they've paid the price. And one who'd been an active climate campaigner said to me, I was known as being a freak. And another one said that they didn't want to be a zealot, and so they dialed down on their language a bit. And the second reason is that politicians feel constrained by the electorate. There was a really striking consistency in my interviews. No MP felt that their voters were putting them under particular pressure to act. So let me turn to that other side of this equation, the citizens. So that's us. But it's worth reflecting that if you've turned up to a webinar on the path to net zero, you're almost certainly an outlier in your views. And it's true that polls show that concern about climate change has increased to really high levels. But it's not clear whether that generalised concern translates or will translate into support for particular climate strategies or policies. And I think that's partly because, quite frankly, so far we haven't asked people to play much of a role. We've done what I've called climate policy by stealth. We've focused on those things like decarbonising the power sector and industry that can be done essentially without people noticing. But as the Committee on Climate Change has made absolutely clear, we can't get to net zero that way through stealth. The changes to transport, land use, distributed electricity generation, demand response, the list goes on. They need people to engage. And I don't mean just engaging as consumers. And I would say that energy policy is one of the worst offenders for squeezing people into a box labelled consumer. But people's engagement with energy is about so much more than buying things in a market. We might buy shares in a wind farm, work in the oil and gas sector. We might worry about climate change and how it impacts our children's futures. This is all about engagement in energy and climate. And of course we vote. So why are we shoving everything into a box labelled consumer? I think it's absolutely vital that we listen to people and involve them in the changes that are ahead. And again, echoing something that Karen said, if we're not careful, if we don't get this right, then climate action could suffer from that wider sweep of anti-expert sentiment and the destabilisation of established centres of knowledge and power, which are now an absolutely central feature of politics around the world, essentially the sort of populist backlash. So let me turn to what I think can be done, what that social contract about the path to net zero might look like. And I think there are three crucial ingredients. The first ingredient is essentially speaking out, an end to climate by stealth. Politicians need to speak absolutely openly about the significance of climate change, and they need to ask people to play their part. And the upsurge of climate emergency declarations, I hope, is the starting point for a more honest politics. Alongside that goes a really clear story of transformation, how acting on climate is necessary and desirable, and how it links to our other priorities as a society, like jobs, health, and fundamentally well-being. And I think the Green New Deal in the US is an example of this. It's very idealistic. It has a particular political flavour that not everyone will like, and in a way, that's the whole point. Contrast that with what we're seeing in politics in the UK. On the right, for example, there's support pledged for the net zero target, and that's great. But we haven't yet seen that articulation of a narrative, a story of transformation. And getting that story right is crucial to the social contract. The second ingredient is engagement. We here at this event are experts on decarbonisation, but we're not experts on people's lives. And I think we should have the humility to ask people to work with us to design climate action that fits with people's lives and aspirations. And that's why over the past few months, I've been part of this incredible experiment, Climate Assembly UK, which is 110 citizens selected to be representative of the country as a whole. They've heard evidence on climate, they've deliberated on possible solutions, and they're about to offer their recommendations to Parliament. And all my experience with these processes has shown me that if you give people the space to learn, to think, and to discuss, citizens offer up a confident and often pretty radical set of answers to a question. And processes like this can be used, it's not about replacing representative democracy, but improving the way it works, because voting, after all, is a really blunt instrument. It's a very limited way of telling politicians what sort of a world you want to live in. The last ingredient, and particularly relevant for energy systems, is a different sort of governance, an end to thinking of people just as passive consumers. And this is all the more the case because it fits entirely with this innovation that we see sweeping the energy system: localised generation, ICT-enabled energy services like demand response, the switch to electric vehicles. They all point to a different role for people and different ways of engaging people in the path to net zero. But if we're to make the most of these opportunities, we need to reform energy governance and allow people to participate not just as passive consumers, but as active participants in energy systems. And I've worked with the iGov project at the University of Exeter to set out what that reformed governance might look like. And this is going to be the focus of some research that I'm beginning now as well. So I want to leave you with this thought. If you care enough about energy and climate to work on it and to join this session, you're already part of the answer. But you as an individual can strengthen that social contract through being really vocal about the challenges we face and being both upfront and upbeat about what changes are needed, and encouraging that debate with people about what that looks like. I would strongly recommend talking to politicians, both national and local politicians, as a person as well as a professional. And if you want to know how to go about that, a charity called Hope for the Future provides some brilliant resources on their website about how to handle conversations with politicians. And, you know, fundamentally, the situation we're in right now makes this all the more crucial, I think, because the opportunity for a climate-focused recovery is there for the taking, but just because it's necessary, just because we have the evidence that it needs to be done, doesn't mean it will happen. So I'll leave it there, and really keen to join the discussion. Thank you.
Becky, as the mother of a teenage son, what is his attitude to all of this?
So I have two teenage sons, and they are fantastically uninterested. I think it's their own form of rebellion. But I have been working a lot with local schools, and, as you said, with the Youth Climate Summit. So that takes the pressure off my own children a little bit, and you know, they'll come round.
Fair enough. I hope that is going to be an easy entrance to the first question that I'm going to pose to all of you. And I'm told that we are absolutely swamped with questions, but we're not swamped with time. Probably many of us wish that we may avoid fossil fuels rushing back, but can't quite believe it. What can we do to make that difference? So we are talking about individuals, people, not just this block, consumers. Anybody want to hurl in a thought on that?
Well, look, Judith, I'll start then.
Thank you, Keith.
So I think, look, there's there's lots everybody can do individually about your own behaviour, and I think if you even just learn some of the lessons from the last 2 months about how much less travelling you've done, how much more walking you've done, people doing more cycling, using video conferences. I mean, if I think about our business, we've sent home 3,600 people to work from home, and that's 3,600 people who are no longer jumping in cars, going on trains, going on planes. For the last 2 months, we've had nobody flying anywhere in the United Kingdom, and nobody using all those carbon emissions. So I think people at an individual level can take lessons from that in terms of, do I really need to be doing what I used to do and how I used to behave? And I think you'll find that each of us individually can therefore make a lot of change going forward. On top of that, it is things like, think about where are you buying your energy? I'm not about to do a crass advert. I wouldn't do that. But, look at where you're getting your energy from, because there again, there may be an easy choice to think about, actually, am I buying my energy from renewable sources, and can I track it back to renewable sources? And just look at those day-to-day activities. And again, for individuals, it depends on what you do, but you can also have a massive impact on your company. So it's not just about how you behave and what you do, but why don't you take that back to your company? You don't need to be a chief executive. You don't need to be a director of the company. But as an employee of a company, take back these things and push and challenge what goes on in the business and on in the company. And then you as an individual, not only are you having an impact from changing your own behaviour, but you're pushing and challenging your entire company and organisation about what they do. Have they shifted their fleet to electric cars? What are they doing about making sure people use video conference instead of jumping on planes, etc.? And again, I think as an individual, you can start to have a big impact that way as well.
Can I come in, Judith?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about that question for me is that it's actually talking about avoiding fossil fuels. And to be honest, I think over the past 2 or 3 decades of climate policy, we've talked a lot about how you have more of the good stuff, like renewables, and we've actually avoided the conversation about how we dial down on fossil fuels, about how we have to phase out the use of fossil fuels, and that is a much harder conversation to have. But we're not doing anyone any favours by not facing up to that. And as Karen said, having a discussion about how we phase out fossil fuels in a way that supports livelihoods is absolutely crucial. And we're not being honest about that at the moment. Just down the road from me in Cumbria, the planning permission was granted for a new coal mine, and I think that is letting down that community, because it's creating jobs which cannot last if we're to get to net zero. So I think being much more honest about essentially doing less of the bad stuff in terms of digging it out of the ground, as well as more of the good stuff. We need to be upfront about that, and we need to work with those communities and support them.
And if I could come in on that,
to all the things that we do get that actually are made from oil, but yeah, Karen, yes.
Yeah, Judith, that's a point that I think that there's several kind of issues wrapped up in that question, and one of them is, kind of all the supply chain emissions. Net zero is very much about what we do in the UK, but I mean, I'm sure, Keith knows that in order to build a windmill, you're having to use, kind of the fossil fuels are used there at the moment. But I think in terms of, I think we really need to think hard when we talk about the change in behaviours that have gone on through this crisis and what can be sustained going forward. And I think much of it is to do with kind of luxury versus necessity. You know, is that we can look at our own behaviours and think, well, where were we kind of using our cars unnecessarily that we can change? But there's a lot of people who have to use their car to get to work. And people who can't afford to go out and get an electric vehicle yet. You know, I mean, I think one thing that really worries me, you know, as we're changing transport, is a lot of people drive second-hand older cars and things like that, and that's all they can afford. And I'm not saying that we should keep doing that going forward, but we need to think carefully about how do you make that evolution and that transition and how people live their life without penalising those who are least able to pay. So I think there are a lot of issues, and I think it's easy where we are at the moment to have the knee-jerk reaction and saying, look, we've shown how we can change, but this change has been incredibly difficult for people. That's why I think it has to be an opportunity for discussion and debate to better understand the questions that we're actually facing here.
I think, sorry, Judith, just briefly, I think Karen raises some really important points there about about fairness and equality and people's ability, and I think that's, to me, that's the challenge for companies. What companies need to be doing, and organisations like us, is we need to be investing to make it easy for people to do this. And to me, that's where the big challenge comes on for companies. It's not about, all just about inventing new things or inventing new bits of technology or saying, look, whoopie-doopie, look at this huge, big, lovely, expensive electric vehicle. It's about how do you make this the obvious choice and the easy choice and the low-cost option. And that's where the big drive's got to do, so that when people are looking at whether it's changing a car or they are looking at how they travel around, actually the green option, it's not just the right option for the environment, it's actually the no-brain option because it's the cheapest option, it's the most easily available option, and it's the sensible thing to do. And that starts to make it easier for people.
Yes. Big hurdles ahead. Not surprisingly, we've had a lot of questions on hydrogen. It's almost impossible to pick which one to go for. Let's go for this one. Green hydrogen holds great opportunity to decarbonise sectors of the economy and represents a demand accelerator for onshore and offshore wind and other green electricity generators. Does so-called blue hydrogen threaten to undermine that? And should government priority and any financial incentives be focused on green, not blue? Who would like to take that first? Come on.
Because I think, that this is one of the issues that we have in the debate. I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm a political economist. I'm not an expert in green or blue technology, but I think the key point is that we shouldn't be focusing just on this technology or that technology. My first question would be, what are the implications of doing either option? What are the costs over different time frames relative to what are the benefits? How do we do it? We're not always looking for the cheapest or the cleanest option. If we're going to have a just transition and continue to deliver prosperity, we have to look at options that essentially become part of our economy, because that's what we're talking about. We're transitioning to a net zero future, and it might be that we go through different phases if it's technologically feasible to do so. So I think I couldn't answer that question because I don't know enough about blue or green hydrogen or the implications, but I would say the people who do and the people who research and work in that area, come and talk to the people on the social science side who need to understand the implications of your option, and we analyse the answers that way.
That's a pretty good answer to that one. Keith, there's one here for you. You and your colleagues at ScottishPower have been as instrumental as any at decarbonising our electrical generation. Don't get too happy yet. More to come, we hope. However, a key difference between electricity and its big brother in terms of climate impact, heat, is that there is as yet no obligation to decarbonise heat. does Keith, or indeed any of you, think that we need emitters of CO2 and NOx emissions from burning gas to be placed under an obligation, in big letters, to reduce emissions, or will price levies be sufficient to drive down fast enough?
Okay, it's a great question actually, and it's one of the biggest conundrums and challenges is how do we deal with heat, and in many respects dealing with electricity has been easy. There'll be lots of engineers jumping off the top of the building right now at me saying that, but in all honesty, dealing with electricity is relatively easy, and the reason it's been relatively easy is, to a huge extent, what we've done just now doesn't impact people's individual lives or their individual economic decisions. So we've built all these wind farms, and they're fantastic and they're brilliant and they're making a huge difference. But when you go home at 5 o'clock at night, you walk through the front door, you put on the light switch, you have no idea at all, and it makes no difference to you at all whether it's coming from a wind farm or a nuclear power plant or a coal station. It's irrelevant to hitting that light switch. As soon as you get into areas like heat and transport, it has a much more intrusive impact on people's lives and on economic decisions and what they do and how they do it. So it's a bigger challenge. What I would say is, at one level, obligations, doing stuff by obligations is not always a brilliant way to incentivize and encourage the right behavior. Okay, I think if you look at the current framework to incentivize people to invest in renewables through the Contracts for Difference framework, it's more of an incentive mechanism. And incentive mechanisms tend to work better than obligations in terms of driving innovation and driving investment. So I think with heat, this again, to me, is going to have to come from industry and it's going to have to come from business. I don't think this can be driven just by consumers. So I think what we need to do is to create the right framework and the right incentive to get the innovation coming through and to get the investment coming through to changing heat networks and creating new heat networks. And my start point would be to look at doing it through creating a framework and an innovation and an incentive-based framework, not through an obligation. And I think you get a far better answer, a far faster answer, if you look at the level of innovation and change that's happened, particularly in an area like offshore wind, and the rapid cost reduction. That's because of incentive, not because of obligation. So I would go down the incentive mechanism route. I don't have one off the top of my head. I think it's a huge piece of work we need to do. There's a whole lot of stuff needs to be done around heat and around the whole challenge of how do you start switching off gas networks if you're moving to electricity, or what do you do with the existing network, or how do you clean the existing network? But not to get depressed about that and the scale of that challenge, what I would say, and I think this was always one of the most important things in Chris and the CCC report, is we've got lots of existing technology to now use it, deploy it, make the most out of it, and it buys us time to look at the second half of the challenge and the latter 20 years of the challenge, where we can bring through new technology and new answers to help support that. So there's time for us to do the innovation, there's time for us to do the investment, there's time for us to find the answers. And I think that's what we need to be doing really, really rapidly now.
Mm. There have been a couple of questions about geothermal. I don't know if those get any of you leaping up and down with excitement. I can hear Karen going, but what are the costs? What are the... So I'm not going to ask her, unless you really want to come in. No, obviously not. Any views on geothermal?
It's not my area, I'm afraid, Judith.
Look, Judith, what I would say again, if I kind of go back to the Committee on Climate Change report, is there's a whole host of technologies out there, and the ones that we can use, the ones we can deploy, let's get on and use them, and they've all got a role to play. And this is where sometimes the other question that gets asked of me a lot as well, what's your view on nuclear power? Look, everything's there. Use everything we've got. Deploy everything we've got. Let's invest in everything we've got, and use all those tools in the box. And if geothermal can play a part, fantastic. If hydrogen can play a part, fantastic. The most important thing is, don't sit and wait for the utopian answer. Otherwise, we'll be sitting here in 20 years' time and we will have done nothing. So, I said once, and I'll say it again now, which electrify the hell out of everything right now, because that's the answer right now. It doesn't mean that's the answer all the way through to 2050. It doesn't mean things like hydrogen or geothermal or other technologies don't have a role to play. Absolutely they will. Absolutely they do. Right now, electrify, electrify, electrify.
Right, I think we've got that message. And you will have probably seen scrolling down yourself that there was one on nuclear as well. It's very interesting. The very first All Energy, we had Matt Simmons from the energy, he was an energy investment banker based in Texas, and largely oil and gas, and quite a controversial speaker to actually invite. And he said, what you need is a basket of energy. You need to hurl everything at it. But there we were, a new, shiny, bright, green show. And people actually booed him off the platform. Well, they didn't boo him off the platform. And a couple of years later, I decided to have speakers from gas, renewables, coal, and nuclear. And we had a poll. There weren't sophisticated polls around in those days, or if they were jolly expensive. So I had lots of coloured bits of paper. To start with, everybody stuck up their green bit of paper. This, after all, was the UK's largest renewable show. By the end, when everybody finished speaking and I asked for another vote, most of them had that handful of colours. You know, they wanted mix and match and just electrify, electrify, electrify. Is there anything that the three of you would like to ask one of the other panelists whilst I carry on looking through the questions?
I mean, can I just make a point on this, sort of the question of which generation technology, because it's very interesting that these debates often sort of default to here are all these different generation technologies, which one should we pick, or what should the mix be? And actually that avoids the fundamental question to me, which is, you know, what is energy for? What is electricity for? Why do we use it? And it neglects the whole demand side. And I'm really pleased to see that you know, now in the academic space there's a dedicated research centre, CREDS at Oxford, which looks at specifically at the demand side. And you know, it's an area that government is really shied away from focusing on, but you know, it's more difficult, but potentially really rewarding to have policy which actually relates to how we use energy, not just how we generate it.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge, isn't it, Becky? That I think that it's not just whether or not there's been enough attention to the demand side. I think the challenge is that the demand, you know, we talk about consumers a lot, but these are people. These are citizens. And that's, you know, millions, and trying to get 65 million people in this country, if you're wanting them to change their behaviour, you know. And also these are citizens, these people elect politicians and things like that. And that's what's made it challenging. And I think you're right. I think there has been a shying away from what has been called the demand side. I think we need to stop calling it the demand side.
Yeah.
Talk about people in society, because that's the real challenge here. If you had some kind of dictatorship, you know, your question about democracy, and you could just force things through, whether or not that would, you know, that could actually happen, I don't know.
Well, actually, even dictators can't do that.
To live in a democracy and do this.
No, so presumably, Becky, the 3% that don't want to live in a democracy, are they thinking that we're going to be better under a dictator? You were about to imply that we wouldn't necessarily be.
I don't think it would be.
Well, I mean, you know, whether or not citizens are allowed to vote, no government can actually rule without the consent of its people. And what you see, you know, even in China, for example, is a kind of, you know, maybe slightly more dysfunctional, but there is still a social contract between, you know, the government has to find ways. So, you know, in the case of China, the rough, and I've spoken to China experts about this, which I don't call myself one, but the sort of rough deal is will provide economic growth instead of votes, essentially. That's very crude, but you know, whatever your political system, you need the support of the electorate. And you know, we see it now in lockdown, that you know, you can only have lockdown with really widespread consent and engagement. You know, the police can't knock on all our doors, can they? And you know, it's the same with low carbon, except I would say it's a different sort of challenge, because you're actually asking for people's sort of active participation and engagement, and so you know, I just don't see, even if we could wave a magic wand and have a benign dictatorship, I just don't think that would work.
And I think equally, Becky, I think even if you got, you know, democracies are not perfect, and even if we had an election and a Green Party got in that could enact all of these policies, consensus is not gained by having an election, because not everybody votes the same way. And we saw things like that with Brexit, where you had a referendum and the people, that didn't end it, because the people who were on the side that didn't win were still very unhappy. So just because you've got a democracy and an electoral system, getting an electoral result doesn't mean you say you've gained social consensus or that you will keep it.
Right, I think we've got time for one last question. Given the massive debt resulting from COVID, how can politicians and decision makers be persuaded to increase this further through capital investment required to achieve net zero? I think you're probably going to say, well, we better have a whole new session on this, but a quick answer from Karen. You just moved forward then, so it's over to you first.
I'm an economist, so you love that question. No, but I mean, I think the crucial thing is that, you know, when government has to spend money, you know, I mean, it's a complex situation, because, you know, who owns debt, you know, like our you know, Bank of England can hold debt, and that can make the debt cheaper. But basically, you know, government will look to invest the people's money if they think there is going to be a return to that money. And, you know, that's why the challenge is to show, and I think this is where we can really get ahead with a lot of net zero actions, because they are investments in our future. We have committed to net zero. So we have to, you know, so the return to investment, the way investment decisions are going to be considered, is already shifting. And so then the challenge is, all right, governments had to spend a lot of money, an awful lot of money, unprecedented amounts of money on this virus. But that doesn't mean to say there's no more money there. It's about making the argument through the stimulus package and subsequent public budgets that these are wise investments to be made on behalf of the people of this country. So it shouldn't be a problem that that we've had to spend a lot of money, so there's nothing left for green. That is just simply not true.
Keith, your company is investing one hell of a lot anyway. How much do you want government to throw money at you as well?
You know, if somebody wants to throw money at me, I'll not say no to it. But you look, the truth here, Judith, there is so much of this we can do without using government money. Yeah. You know, and you look at electricity generation and renewables. We're not asking the government for any money. We don't need the government to put any money into that. Industry will put that money in, and this is where it, you know, I just come back to the point, you know, earlier about creating the right frameworks and the right mechanisms. If you create the right frameworks and the right mechanisms that give investors confidence, and that's what things like contracts for difference do. It's like the regulatory mechanism in the UK, the RIIO mechanism for networks, for transmission and distribution, give investors confidence, then you don't need the government to put money into it. Investors will come forward and investors will put money into it. Where the government can help is in some of the early stage stuff, you know, some of the stuff in around innovation and bringing new technologies to bear for the future, then they often do benefit hugely if there's a bit more government support and government stability around them. But the big investments around renewables, around the network, I think around transport infrastructure, I think ultimately around heat, I don't think that requires government money. I think actually you get companies to do it, and it's incumbent upon then investment coming into the country. And the great thing about that is it generates benefit, it generates wealth, it generates jobs, and it generates manufacturing. And that's the way to do it.
Well, I'm not going to ask you to come in, Becky, because I think that's such a positive method. message, unless you're going to lynch me afterwards for it. But I'd like to stop there and thank all of you and the with us but not with us, Chris, for your input. And to that percentage which said they hadn't been to All Energy, can I point you towards the website, which is, of course, www.all-energy, we love that hyphen, all-energy.co.uk. And thank you all so much for being with us. Heat's come up. Do register for tomorrow's heat session. Offshore wind talked about, that's this afternoon, and hydrogen. Take all those questions about hydrogen to that session tomorrow afternoon. But for now, can we say thank you so much for being with us, speakers and huge audience, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.